Martin Witte works at TÜV Süd. His official title there, which I just learned on LinkedIn, is Senior Director Strategic Business Development, which definitely is a long title. But the way I actually met Martin was pretty randomly. I think he reached out and we just had a chat. And what I really thought was really cool, and that's the way I met Martin, was he firstly works at a notified body, but he's really interested in bringing digitalization to technical documentation and kind of solving this problem of everything's super painful to document. It's like in Google Sheets or it's in Excel and everything sucks and people are unhappy. And I think he has a lot of this like innovative thinking of let's actually use like modern tools for this. So I'm particularly excited about this talk. And yeah, Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm also happy to being here. And yes, this is not really connected to my actual work. Yeah, so I actually do stuff like picking the right customers for us and looking into what are the next technologies we want to approach as a notified body. But the digitalization topic is something that, yeah, is with me in my life for quite a while now. And yeah, let me give you an insight into how the other side of all this development and documentation stuff works, and why I believe that digitalization is so extremely important for us all. What I typically do first, and I believe for the most of you this is fairly clear, what the difference between digitization and digitalization is. So, but that's not clear everywhere. And in German, there is no distinguish in the wording, which makes things even more complicated. So I think medical device industry, and I'm not talking about software companies, but I'm talking more about companies who are on the market for 20, 30, 50 years already. I think they are very advanced in digitization. So what they did is they scanned all their documents. So that's awesome, because everything is digitally available. What is really bad is that they don't digitalize their stuff. So they don't do anything with the data or think about moving away from documents. Now, that is also very important to understand as a startup or as a software, as a medical device company, because the environment we are all working in is really traditional, paper-based, folder structures, and all that stuff. And well, based on the MDR, and I'll give some of insights into what the MDR requires manufacturers to do and what we as notified bodies need to check. So the MDR has a clear requirement on that there needs to be a technical documentation for a device. And it doesn't matter if it's a software as a medical device or an X-ray scanner. So there needs to be a technical documentation. And this technical documentation needs to consist the elements of Annex 2 and 3. So you can use Annex 2 and Annex 3 from the MDR as kind of a checklist. And if you can check everything off there, you are good to go and you can submit your technical documentation to the notified body. Well, additionally, manufacturers shall keep this technical documentation and other stuff like the EU Declaration of Conformity, copy of relevant certificates, amendments, supplements, and so on and so forth, available for at least 10 years. Okay. Yeah, well, after the last device covered by the Declaration of Conformity has been placed on the market. And in certain cases, for implants, it's 15 years. Now that means 15 years from the last implanted pacemaker, for example, you need to keep the technical documentation available. No, from when that device is actually explanted. That is a really long time. So putting this together, those are the tasks of the medical device manufacturer. And I'm working in this field for 12 years now, and was also working with this pacemaker company located in Berlin for quite a while. I was also a colleague of Benjamin back then. And for me, it was already strange that I found things like this sometimes in folders. Well, that is the way how people back then thought digitalization works. Yeah, so they created documents, they stored these documents on this hard disk, and maybe on their computer, and maybe there were network drives. I don't really know what happened back then. So the date on this one here, it's a fake date. 1992 is actually the date when we did our first assessment of a pacemaker, and actually the documentation came in as paper. 10 folders of paper. Maybe in 1992 it was only 2 folders because the requirements weren't so strict. But now the question for you as a manufacturer, of course, is what does the notified body need? Yeah, so we, the notified bodies, need to assess your documentation, your design, your verification activities, your validation activities, your clinical data, and all that stuff. So for you, it's of course important to understand what do we need. And I do this with an example here. And the example is the description of a medical device. Yeah, it's very high level. And what we discussed about earlier, making the documentation after doing design activities sounds interesting, but then do the documentation right at least. Yeah. So the description of the medical device, where does this come from? So typically the Annex 2 technical documentation from the NDR requires that there needs to be a device description, that there needs to be information supplied by the manufacturer, which typically is labels, instruction for use, and stuff like that. Then design and manufacturing information, general safety and performance requirements, so the link to Annex 1, and the general, the benefit risk ratio, as well as risk management information. And last but not least, all the verification and validation activities covering also clinical data. Now, as I said, let's go into this device description topic. Well, if we dig deeper into section 1 of the Annex 1, we'll find a lot of things that are supposed to be the device description. So the device description is something very general, yeah, a product name, trade name, general description, stuff like that. Then we have something like a basic UDI. We have an intended patient population. We have principle of operation. We have rationales, why this is actually a medical device and not a non-medical product. Then we need information about the risk classification, novel features compared to earlier versions of the device, and accessories, but also information about variants of the device, key functional elements, raw materials if applicable, and technical specifications. So what we see here, the technical documentation starts with something that is explaining the medical device, giving all the relevant information on a very high level at the first step, but already detailed enough for us as a third party to understand what the medical device is there for and what it does, and so on and so forth. Now, let's look into the upper left part only. Now, if we only look at the general device description, then we have the product name, the trade name, the general description of the device, the intended purpose, and the intended user. And now again, let's only pick one of those, the intended purpose. Yeah. The intended purpose is an element you will need for your medical device more or less everywhere. Yeah. You will have the intended purpose in your clinical investigation plan, in your clinical evaluation report, in your summary on safety and clinical performance, in your periodic safety update report. You will also put it somewhere into Udamid, or we will do it. It will be in your risk management. It is for sure in your instruction for use. It is in the patient information if you, for example, have an implant. It will be in some of your verification and validation documents. It will be used for the classification decision, and it will be in numerous other places. And on the other side, that's your internal documentation. What goes outwards is, of course, all these documents, plus the application you're filling in with the notified body. It will be on the certificate, and we will also make sure that it is in UDAMATE. Now, for companies being around for quite a while, the biggest challenge is consistency. They cannot manage to get all this information straight and consistent. And the reason for that is typically the intended purpose of a device is fixed very early in the development phase. And then someone might create a risk management file. And later, someone is planning clinical evaluation activities, and maybe between the review phases, the design stages, the intended purpose needs to be altered a little bit because the verification shows, well, the one purpose we will not meet. Now you have to update all your documents. That's actually the way how these organizations work. Yeah, they have this information redundantly available in multiple places. And that is a big, big, big challenge for first the manufacturers and for us, because looking at the intended purpose that is given to us in the application forms means that this intended purpose is the one that will go onto the certificate, one by one. No comma added, no comma removed, one by one. Because we are not allowed to make any interpretations here, because we are a third party, what do we know about the intended purpose of your device? Now, if it is not consistent with your documents, then a very silly thing happens. The notified body needs to ask the manufacturer to either correct it and writes a deficiency, because the intended purpose in the clinical investigation plan and the clinical evaluation report don't match. So how is the clinical data from a study applicable to the clinical evaluation that is performed when the intended purpose of the device is different? And this can become really, really stupid, because we can really discuss about commas or side sentences here. So it is extremely important that this is consistent. Same is true for all other documents where this is used. Now, if we look at the intended purpose as an information, I'll have an example on the next slide. And this example I have taken from the internet, so it's freely available. It is a family of implanted pacemakers. Surprisingly that I took something like this. And these pacemakers are intended to be implanted for all bradycardia arrhythmia indications. And the primary objective of the therapy consists of improving patient symptoms. Okay. Well, this is a really, really broad intended purpose and really unspecific, I would say. Yet, what we see here already is in this intended purpose, we again have a lot of individual information. Yeah, so we know, it's a family of implanted pacemakers. Typically, this means that there are different basic UDIDIs in the background. Pacemakers are typically developed single chamber, two double chamber, and three chamber versions, and those typically are sold and marketed under the same brand name. So what we know here is there is a lot of variance. Then we know that there is something related to bradycardia arrhythmia. So this is something like a patient condition, I would say. And then there is a objective of the device, and that is a therapy, and that therapy should improve something. Okay. Can we measure this by the information provided here? Not really. But what we see here is that already the first two sentences of the intended purpose seem like elements we can store in boxes. So like this. So what typically my view to such information is that is a collection of information units. Yeah. So if you put it in a database or wherever, doesn't really matter, but all these elements are individual information, and also something like the patient population, the age, the gender, whatsoever. those are little tiny bits of information. And when we call them information units, then we can say, okay, what information units do we actually have? Well, in this specific case, we have a device name, we have an indication for use, we have medical conditions, and we have patient selection criteria. And there are a lot more. And if I would go back to the slides we had in the beginning, and I will do this real quickly, don't get seasick now. If we look back at this one, then we see that there is only for the device description so much information available that we can fill a full database with all that. Because we've only talked about this. And then we can also talk about the basic UDIDIs and about the intended patient population, which is linked to the intended purpose, the principles of operation. And also a very interesting thing is what are similar devices to your device. So a very, very broad and detailed set of information units. Now I'm switching back to the slide we were. Also, sorry for getting seasick. So here we were. And now the biggest challenge for manufacturers is they might have all this information available, but now they need to show it in a way that it is understandable and usable by the notified body, where there is a bunch of people, human beings, looking at the data. So all that data from databases or information management systems need to be shown in a human readable format. So, and the biggest challenge here in my mind is the very, very broad statement in the beginning of the MDR technical documentation annexes. So that's actually Annex 2 and 3, because Annex 3 is talking about post-market surveillance activities and the documentation around that. But the technical documentation needs to be prepared in a clear, organized, readily searchable, and unambiguous manner. Okay, good. Clear. Okay, I can do this with a folder structure on a cloud drive or on a disk or on a CD-ROM or on a USB stick. Yeah, clear structure I can achieve. Organized, yeah, okay, if something is organized or clear, clear is maybe more the content of my documents. Then searchable, first challenge to some manufacturers, especially for those who digitized their printouts. Typically, they don't OCR them, so we are not able to search through the documentation. And then when there are inconsistencies, of course, we can't say that this is unambiguous. Now, that makes it for us extremely challenging, and every time one of these elements is not fulfilled, we might need to write a reject or open a deficiency round, which extends the approval process. Now, also as a little insight into how we think, or how I think the structure of the regulatory standard documents and your documents is, and what we actually do with it is, first of all, there is the MDR, and the MDR is long, and there is a lot of articles in it, and there is some annexes, and typically the requirements are in the annexes. And the rest is law text that needs to be followed, which sometimes also includes some requirements the manufacturers have to fulfill. So it's not really easy to check the MDR for the requirements that are applicable to your device. Now, if we look now at, for example, the Annex 1, which is the backbone of all conformity assessments and the backbone of all CE marking, the Annex 1 is full of requirements. And I'm saying requirements, not clauses, because a clause can have several requirements. Now, thinking back, a requirement is something like an information unit. Yeah, you want to fulfill a requirement that is applicable to your device. So first of all, you need to select if a requirement is applicable or not. And then if it is applicable, you want to fulfill it, I guess. Now, what you typically do is you look for a standard, because that awesome standard that is available, and you don't need to think about it anymore, because there is actually a big group of people, very smart people typically, who decided what is the standard for a certain device group. Sometimes these standards are outdated, sometimes they are updated, and sometimes critical technical elements are fixed in standards, but sometimes not. That's actually what I see. Now, a standard typically consists of clauses. Now, what would you do? A clause in a standard, putting together also a certain requirement, a lower level than actually the MDR requirement, because the MDR requirement, so what is in the Annex 1, needs to fit to approximately 500,000 medical devices. And standards are more specific to a certain device group and are therefore more specific. Now, for example, you find when we talk about a pacemaker, or let's talk about a pacemaker lead, because that's also a very good example where standards don't update quickly enough. Let's say a pacemaker lead that is implanted into the heart that will see a lot of mechanical stress over the time of implantation. And mechanical stress means heartbeats, because this cable is directly positioned in the heart, and every time the heart contracts, the cable is bent. Now, let's say this cable needs to withstand 47,000 cycles of bending. Well, that's actually a requirement from a standard. Typically 10 years of implanted lead will see 400 million cycles. Has the standard been updated? No. Is this a problem to the market? Yes. Was this a problem in the past? Did people die because of elements like bending fatigue? Yes. So that's the reason why standards sometimes, good that they are there, but maybe they don't fulfill the state of the art. So if you use this requirement for 47,000 bending cycles, then it's very clearly defined what you need to do. So what you typically do is you buy test equipment and do a test plan. And in the end, you have a test result. Now, the requirement from the MDR that the device needs to fulfill certain mechanical stresses is linked to this clause. This clause is in your test plan. The test plan is linked to a test result. Maybe it is attached a method description, potentially, maybe not. Because if it's one by one what is in the standard, the reference to the standard would be sufficient. So then you have a test result. And this test result is now checked. First of all, if there is no standard, you cannot use a clause from the standard. You need to come up with a test plan yourself, and also need to describe why you choose that a certain test plan is appropriate. So why is it scientifically justified to do a test in a certain manner? Well, in the end, you have a test result, and that test result you link with the requirement and with the source of method. And then what we do is this green line now. And the green line means that we check your test result against the requirements. And either it is fulfilled or it's not. And when it's not fulfilled, we'll give you feedback. And now the relation here that needs to be prepared is actually, it's also written in the Annex 2 of the MDR, that for information concerning general safety and performance, so Annex 1, the applicable requirements and the ones that are not applicable need to be mentioned, and these need to be linked to a method, and then the method needs to be provided as well as a documented proof of compliance to a certain requirement. Now, what typically companies do is they create something out of this program. And this is also very understandable, because if we looking back into these organizations which are there for decades, everybody believes to know Excel. At least they know they have it on their computer. they also are convinced they can use it properly. And somehow it makes sense to put this relation that I've shown into Excel. Well, I don't really think that this is appropriate. Excel is so much better for business calculations than for putting text into it. And you have to do it manually, yeah? Or you are in the lucky situation that you have a database filling the Excel table and then send it to your notified body. So forget it. So what would you do now? Yeah? Well, all you need is love and mojitos, or invest in a data model. And this seems, I think, for software as a medical device companies, pretty simple because there is a lot of software already. But what is really problematic, there is no such thing as a off-the-shelf tool that you can use. So you need to customize a lot and need to come up with solutions, and you need to go through this thought process of what is actually my information unit. So I think it would be very awesome if we have something available in the ecosystem, in the community, that is agreed upon and that is available to everyone. So maybe we should write a standard. Yeah, or maybe we do it open source. Because in my mind, and this is my personal view to this, in my mind, there should not be any advantage or disadvantage related to financial power an organization has to get a proper data model for a medical device. And this is now a little bit of advertisement, not for TÜV Süd. It's actually an initiative some people and myself created to actually create such a open source system, and we call it medical device knowledge units. And our aim is to create an open source data model that everybody can use and adapt to their needs. And in the end, on the notified body side, I also want to get away from this thing and actually think of an interface where in best case, there is a constant exchange of information, and maybe you as a manufacturer needs to put a freeze on the data, on a certain data set so that we can review it. But I don't believe in cloud storages and stuff. I would rather like to see an exchange of databases over an interface. I'm very clear about this being a very, very fantastic future, and we might never see it, but I think it's always useful to dream about something. So that's it from my side, and I'm happy to discuss questions and ideas. And if you'd like to join this initiative, go to that page and send us an email. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Martin, for that interesting talk. Before we actually head over to the discussion room, maybe I have some questions towards you. Like most recently, Jauke asked, how would you submit a digitalized technical documentation to the notified body? So in the sense of what I've typically seen, and my experience is limited, is you export this huge bunch of PDF files, put it in a zip archive, and like throw it over the fence and kind of hope that something good comes out of it. But maybe you have more experience to share.
And what you're saying is actually also my current recommendation. Yeah. So if you have a technical documentation available, create a structure, and we still need to think in this human-friendly structure of maybe folders and subfolders. And then into these folders and subfolders, you put your documents, so the evidence. Recommendation here, just stick to Annex 2. Don't overthink the structure. Yeah, it is there, use it. And I think this is, I've heard actually that some notified bodies won't accept that, but we would. And I can only talk for us, but I think this is a good structure. I do know manufacturers who like to put everything in one huge PDF. Remembering reviewing these documents, I don't like this. It is not simple technically. And yeah, you won't find the information you need.
Yeah, interesting. And so maybe like a slightly changed question from Mara. Sorry, Mara. She mentioned they're using Jira to do requirements documentation and change requests. And maybe like if I generalize this question, like, is it even possible to use a tool which doesn't allow a PDF export? Because, for example, what I'm seeing is some startups maybe use GitLab issues or so, and it's actually not trivial to export GitLab issues unless you code something yourself. So is that even an option, or should you generally select a tool which has a PDF export?
I mean, today I would recommend this, yes. In that bright future, somewhere 2120, we might be able to exchange such information really through an interface. But I would say now to the next 5 years, you must make sure that you have a data format that is accessible by the notified body, and that is PDF. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe actually one one question from me from my prior talk is actually what's your opinion, if you have one, on like the absolute versus relative requirements problem. So if a company just defines like the changes and documents that and exports it in a PDF, would that be sufficient for you as software requirements, or would you always want an absolute specification which says this is what the software does at this very moment?
Yeah. So we need to have a snapshot of what the software does at a very moment. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I mean, that's super great, and it's really, really cool for you to actually give definitive answers, because you, again, you see these documents on the other side
Yeah.
of the review pipeline, I guess.